Hello S2 and welcome to your next lesson on World War One, where today we're going to look at the trenches. So we're going to look to understand what the trenches actually were in this lesson, and then next lesson we're going to focus a bit more on the conditions that soldiers found themselves in the trenches. So if you take a new heading in your jotter for today, which is understanding the trenches. Now what we're looking to do today is to understand what a trench or what trench warfare is and why it was used. I'm looking to explain what is meant by the word stalemate, identify key features of a typical trench, so what did it actually look like, and describe what the trenches were actually like, answering the describe question. We'll focus a bit more on the conditions in the trenches next lesson. So, to start with, we're going to look to explain what a stalemate is. Now, just to give you some background to the trenches being built and what leads us to this point. So we know from the lesson on the assassination that war has now been declared and countries are now at war. Now, in Britain, once war being declared, men joined the queue. So after the outbreak of the war, recruiting offices were besieged by volunteers. You could see in this picture here just how many people volunteered to join up and fight in the war. The public buildings were turned into new offices across the country. A lot of administrative and medical staff were found to work in them and process the thousands of men who were very eager to fight and volunteer. Now this photograph shows the queue outside the Central London recruiting depot at New Scotland Yard in August 1914. Now some areas experienced such a rush that they sent men away with an appointment to come back another day. Now although most men waited patiently for their turn, there were reports of queue jumping and mounted police being seen to try and control the crowds. As you could see here, there's a horse there. So men were very, very eager to rush, join up and fight. Now once they had joined, they then had to pass the test. Now the army could not accept every single volunteer. All new soldiers had to meet age restrictions. Nationally, obviously they had to be from Britain, so they had a nationality criteria. They had to pass a medical examination. Now this was all designed to reject volunteers who maybe weren't fit enough on health conditions, and that could be for various reasons. A lot of soldiers or volunteers at this time were living in substandard housing, very, very poor conditions, so a lot of them weren't able to join. Now this photograph here shows a man who's undergoing the army eye test. Now when the rush of recruits peaked, the height limit was raised for volunteers, so you had to be a minimum of 5'3" to 5'6" to prevent an unmanageable flood of volunteers ultimately. So it moved from being 5'3" to 5'6", so you had to be a minimum of 5'6" to join the army. Now this was lowered actually again later on as the war progressed, as numbers actually dwindled, but at one point you had to be at least 5'6". Ultimately, when it ends up getting really tough, as we'll find out about for the British, a lot of the medical examinations, a lot of the tests are actually just skipped and men are rushed to the front line, and that leads to a lot of men who are actually underage joining as well. Once you've passed the test, you then need to make a promise. So if you're successful in various tests, then you had to make a promise to do your duty, and this was in a ceremony led by recruiting officers. So you see there on the right hand side you've got the two recruiting officers and you've got men there making a promise. Now sometimes men were asked to recite an oath, for example, simultaneously in groups to speed up the process, as you can see in this photograph here. So 4 men being asked to make their promise at the same time. Now the oath required every new recruit to swear to faithfully defend His Majesty, his heirs and his successors against all enemies. And it also required each man to obey the authority of all generals and officers set over to me, and recruits had to pledge to serve as long as the war lasted. Once you've passed your test, you've made your promise, you then join a unit. Now, join a unit. Lord Kitchener, whose face you remember from the propaganda posters, who was pointing, "The army needs you," he was Secretary of State for one. He was responsible for the recruitment campaign. Now, his first appeal on the 7th of August 1914 for an additional 100,000 men to the army was very, very successful, because within 8 weeks nearly 750,000 men had actually joined the army. Now some new soldiers took on specialist roles if they had special skills, like being able to drive, for example, but most volunteers became infantrymen in the new battalions. Now each battalion numbered around 1,000 men, which were attached to existing regiments. Now many of these new units were known as PALS battalions. Like this photograph here, this is from Preston down in England. Now, these units allowed friends, workmates, or those who had a common bond, like say sporting success, to fight together. So you could join with your friends and be in the same battalion. So that's how it became known as the Pals Battalion. Once you joined your unit, you then go to camp. So a recruit's transformation from civilian to soldier life really starts to begin at this point. Now, this is the training camps that are set up across Britain. Now, over the tough months, the volunteers are forced to leave their old lives behind, and they learn new military discipline, they learn drills, and learn how to fight with a rifle and a bayonet. Now, many lived in tents, as you can see in this picture here. This is Leeds Pals Battalion that are in this picture here, and their camp is in Yorkshire Dales. Now, their lives are now controlled by the army, so men from every walk of life, it could be clerks, it could be teachers, it could be factory workers, it could be shop workers, they were all crammed together. And for a lot of men at this time, this was the first time they'd actually been away from home. Ultimately, although those camps sprang up across Britain, everyone was fighting for a common cause, there was some tension, there was worries about drunkenness in the camps that went on as well. But these camps are now set up. And then the last stage for soldiers, once they've been to the camp and they've went through their few months of training, they then say goodbye. So the weeks and months spent as a trainee soldier improved the health of a lot of the men. Some had put on a lot of weight through army food, through the exercise, and through the routine, ultimately. Now, this is soldiers here going through a march through London's Regent Park, as you can see in the photograph. Now, ultimately, soldiers who were now departing for war were often waved off by civilian workers, so mostly women and some men who stayed at home to work as well, they would wave the men off. For a lot of men, this would be their very first time ever going abroad. And each soldier carried a message from Lord Kitchener in their paybook, and that reminded the soldiers that ultimately they need to be courteous, considerate and kind to local people and allied soldiers, and to avoid the temptations in both wine and women. Now, once they have been sent to fight, the main area that they're going to be fighting in is France. Now, this is known as the Western Front. Now, as you can see here with the dotted black line across the map, that's where the trenches were going to be built, and that's where a lot of the British soldiers would fight. So part of it was in Belgium, as you can see at the top there, and it mentions the Battle of Ypres. It's got certain battles mentioned here that Scots are heavily involved in as well. The Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun, and the black line going right across is the trench system that was developed. Now, what does the word stalemate actually mean when we're thinking about stalemate? Well, stalemate is when neither side can win. So if you want to note this down your jotter, that's what stalemate actually is. Now, this is the situation that's created by trench warfare. Both sides, so the British and the French, dig themselves in when they're fighting against the Germans at this point on the Western Front. So both sides dig themselves in, and it means that neither side can really win. It's a bit of a stalemate on the Western Front. You also have barbed wire in the trench to defend yourself against oncoming attack from the soldiers. So that was placed there in front of your trench. Now, what they would actually do is cut very, very small holes in some of the barbed wire, so when you were attacking, that gave you a wee passageway to get through. But the barbed wire was supposed to slow down the oncoming attack from the enemy soldiers. You also had aircraft was a feature in the trench system, because aircraft would obviously go out to look for what the enemy trench is actually like, and to spot any oncoming attack as well. You have the front trench system there, so right on the front line, which is very, very tough, because that's obviously, you're right at the front line there against any oncoming attack. You've got a support trench, which is just placed further behind, and you've also got machine guns that are built in as well. Now, this picture here is more typical of a German trench. The German trenches were actually a lot more sophisticated and better built than the British and French. The Germans actually used former coal miners to help build their trenches. So they would actually build sometimes concrete machine gun buildings as well to protect their machine guns. You have a reserve trench at the back as well. And then behind your trench system, you would have artillery guns. Now, these artillery guns, which we'll find out more about when we look at weapons, would shoot bombs, shoot shells onto the enemy trench and an oncoming attack. They could fire shells for miles, the artillery guns. You had a communication trench further back as well. And in some trenches, the Germans in particular, they dug deep dugouts for their soldiers to stay in, and especially for their commanding officers as well. And then you had a frontline dugout there as well, where you could sleep as well. So that's how your typical trench was laid out. But this is more typical of a German trench. It's a bit more sophisticated. The British and French trenches were not as sophisticated with the dugouts, for example. You'll see as well the trench system is never built in a straight line, so the soldiers would never dig right in a straight line. The reason for doing that, if a bomb hits a certain area of the trench, then it keeps the bomb and the impact in that area, as opposed to if it was a straight line, it would be easier to attack. This picture as well shows you typical conditions inside the trenches, which we'll be looking at next lesson. So you've got here soldiers, some digging parts of the trench there, maintaining it. You've got a soldier with their rifle, ready for an oncoming attack. You've got a soldier looking through the periscope to spot if there's any oncoming attack. You've actually got a soldier sitting there writing a letter home, and you've got a soldier sleeping as well. You'll see that there's a dog. There was dogs in the trenches used to carry letters to different parts of the trenches, and you'll see there quite a key feature of the trenches was rats that we'll look at. Rats were all around the trenches as well. It could get very, very wet and very, very muddy in the trenches as well. Now, to help us identify the key features of a trench, what we're looking to do here is look at the following image, and what you're going to try and do is to recreate this picture in your jotter. So make sure you try and label the key parts of the picture as well. So here's the picture here. So if you pause the video at this point to draw this picture, it doesn't need to be an artist impression, just a sketch as best you can. Make sure you label the key parts of the drawing as well. So you've got, this is the different parts of the trench that you can label. You'll see there's sandbags are quite a common feature in the trench as well. The sandbags are supposed to also protect the soldiers as well. You'll see the trench was roughly 2 meters deep, and you've got different parts of it labelled there. So pause the video at this point to allow you to sketch this picture. Okay, this is some images of soldiers in the trenches here. You could see some of them sleeping there. This is a bit of rest that they would have. A lot of the time in the trenches they weren't actually fighting. They would have lots of tasks to carry out and be getting prepared for any sort of enemy attack. This shows you another picture of the trenches, and this has obviously been damaged by a potential bomb that's hit the trenches. You see the sandbags have fallen, and some of the wood that's been supporting the trench has also been damaged as well. You've also got an injured soldier lying there as well. And this image here shows you soldiers in the trench waiting for an oncoming attack as well, with their rifles at the ready. This picture here shows you as well in the trenches, duck boards being laid down. You've got the sandbags there at the side as well. The duck boards are laid down to try and keep soldiers' feet dry and to stop them getting very wet. Here's another image in the trench, and this shows you heavily the barbed wire that existed in the trenches as well. So what we're going to look to do next is describe what life was like in the trenches. So we've got here 5-finger fact. So what you're looking to do is to draw your hand in your jotter and watch the following video clip and write down 5 facts about life in the trenches. Now I've posted the video clip on Teams and the instructions on Teams, so if you want to watch that and write down 5 facts about life in the trenches. Okay, the last task that we're going to do today is describing an event, so describe questions. So what we're looking to do is to answer the question, describe the trenches on the Western Front during World War I. So you're going to use the picture that you sketch in your jotter to help you to answer this. Now this question is asking you obviously to describe an event or issue using facts from your own knowledge. So the question is worth 4 marks, so therefore you need to write 4 sentences about the trenches during World War I. Now firstly, make a wee list of 4 facts about what the trenches were like. So use your picture. So for example, you could mention they've got barbed wire. You can mention that there's sandbags in the trenches. You could mention that there'd be a periscope in the trenches. You could mention the trenches would be about 2 meters deep. Anything at all about the trenches that you've got from your picture. So just 4 facts there. So just make a wee list in your jotter. Then write your introductory sentence. So there are many different features of the trenches on the Western Front during World War I. So that starts off your describe question. And then finally just use your wee list to write the answer to the question here, writing 4 sentences in total. You can challenge yourself. You can gain additional marks by adding more detail to each of your points. So for example, you could say the trenches were often surrounded by barbed wire. This was to protect the soldiers from any attacks. That would get you 2 marks because that's the develop point. Or you could just make 4 simple points. For example, the trenches were often surrounded by barbed wire. There's 1 mark. Then make 3 more points. Okay, so what you're looking to upload via Teams. Firstly, just what is a stalemate? So your definition of that. Your sketch of a trench. 5 facts from the video, and I've put the link obviously in the instructions as well, and your answer to the describe question on trenches. Okay, so that's what you're looking to upload. If there's any issues with anything that we've covered in this lesson, then please just let your teacher know. Thank you very much.